He hadn't spoken a full sentence in 7 years. The wind carried voices sometimes, his wife's laughter, his daughter's cry, but they lived only in the spaces between storms. Calder Boone had built a world where silence did not betray him. Until the knock came. Not desperate, not frantic, just 4 dull raps, intentional, like judgment. On the porch stood 7 Lakota girls, blood on their skirts, a baby in their arms, and a storm behind their eyes. One stepped forward and said, clear as a gunshot, "They killed our brothers." The dog heard it first. Ears perked, body stiffening near the hearth, the old collie gave a low, cautious whine. Calder Boone looked up from the half-whittled pine branch in his hands, his fingers stained with sap, his knuckles raw from the cold. He heard it then, too. 4 knocks. Measured, not the kind a neighbor made, not that he had any left. Outside, the wind had stilled. That in itself was unsettling. In the canyon, the wind was constant, howling, humming, pushing dust and ghosts against the dry wooden siding. When it went quiet, something was always wrong. He stood slowly. The joints in his knees ached from years of solitary labor, fixing fences no one crossed, tilling soil too bitter for crops, stacking firewood for winters he no longer expected to outlive. Calder moved to the door, hand brushing the rusted rifle propped beside it. He didn't lift it. Not yet. When he opened the door, the first thing he noticed was the blood. Not a lot, just enough to say violence had come and gone and left these girls standing in its wake. Mud clung to their hems, dust streaked their cheeks. One of them, the youngest, maybe 10, clutched a tight bundle to her chest. It made a sound. Not a cry, but a tiny mule of life pushing up against cold air. The one in front, tall, calm, no more than 20, met his gaze without flinching. Her braids were singed at the ends. Her left arm was wrapped in cloth that had once been part of someone else's dress. Her name, he'd learn later, was Wicháhpi, Star. Calder didn't speak, not because he didn't want to, but because the years had made it feel like breaking some sacred seal. But then she said it. "They killed our brothers." Her voice carried the weight of fire. The girls behind her did not cry. They did not plead. They waited. Calder stepped back from the door, gesturing them in without a word. The dog moved aside, tail low but not tucked. The fire inside snapped like it understood what was coming. As the last girl crossed the threshold, thunder broke overhead. A low, rolling drum of something older than justice, something closer to reckoning. And for the first time in years, Calder Boone wished he still believed in prayers. Calder hadn't always been silent. Once his voice had carried over cattle drives and poker tables, across church pews and over his daughter's cradle. It had whispered promises to a woman named May in the dark warmth of their bedroom and shouted warnings across battlefield smoke in Tennessee. That voice had comforted, commanded, cursed, until the night it failed. He buried May and their baby girl on a hill behind the house, not far from where the cottonwoods leaned over the creek. The men who killed them were never held accountable. Deputies, they'd claimed to be, chasing stolen livestock. Calder knew different. They rode with syndicate pay, looking to clear land of troublesome elements. A half-Cherokee woman and her infant didn't fit their vision of Wyoming's future. So they lit the barn, shot the dogs, and left the house in ash. Calder had been gone for 2 days gathering strays. He returned to smoke and silence. He never spoke again. Not to the marshals who came too late, not to the preacher who offered hollow words at the funeral, and not to the men in town who avoided his eyes but welcomed syndicate coin. Calder bought the land outright, rebuilt what little he needed, and fenced the rest off. Isolation became easier than vengeance. Vengeance, he'd learned, fed on everything: hope, memory, even love. Better to bury it where no one could find it. He talked only to his animals. Quiet commands to the horses, a few fond words to the dog. The wind carried the rest. Winters hardened him. Summers scarred him. The scars he didn't mind. What hurt worse were the days when he couldn't remember his daughter's voice. He tried to summon it sometimes in the hush just before dawn, but it came back twisted, fading, like water poured into sand. Each day became ritual: wake before light, feed the stock, repair whatever the wind had broken in the night. Eat alone, sleep in shifts. There were no visitors. The trail to his ranch wasn't marked, and that was deliberate. If anyone came that far, they meant trouble. Until the girls came. They didn't fit into his world. They cracked it, shattered the brittle rhythms he had spent 7 years crafting. But as they settled into the corners of his home that first night, sharing quiet words in Wicháhpi and wrapping the baby tighter against the cold, Calder felt something shift. Not loudly, not suddenly, just a small, unsettling fracture in the wall he'd built around himself. Wicháhpi didn't thank him. None of them did. And somehow that made him trust them more. Gratitude felt like a mask. These girls weren't hiding behind anything. They had survived something unspeakable and weren't waiting to be saved. They were waiting for something else. Maybe he was too. They slept lightly that night, if at all. Calder remained in his old rocking chair, rifle within reach, watching the fire smolder and listening for sounds beyond the wind. The girls spread out on the floor, some curled together for warmth, others staring into the flickering shadows with eyes that had seen too much. The baby whimpered now and then, soothed by a sister's soft humming. At first light, Calder stepped outside. Frost rimed the porch rail. He scanned the ridgeline for riders, but saw only the slow crawl of dawn across the canyon. His land stretched quiet and empty, just as he liked it. But the silence had changed. It was no longer a comfort. It felt like a held breath. When he came back inside, Wicháhpi was waiting. She stood near the hearth, silhouetted by firelight, arms crossed, steady-eyed. She did not ask permission to speak. "We came here on purpose," she said. Calder didn't answer. He just watched her, waiting. "They killed our brothers 3 nights ago. Our camp was in the low trees near the southern fork of the Black Hills. Cold season lodge. We had no warning. They came fast and loud, shot the sentries first, burned the food stores, took what they wanted, left the rest bleeding or burning." Her voice didn't waver. Not once. She wasn't telling it for pity. She was stating fact. "We weren't there when it started. Some of us had gone out to gather dry wood. When we came back, we saw the fires and hid in the rocks, waited until they left." Calder's jaw tightened. The girls had looked shaken when they arrived, but not helpless. There was something honed in the way they moved, the way they watched the corners of the room. Survivors. Fighters. "They wore badges," she said, softer now. "Not real ones. Private. Hired by white ranchers who say the land's theirs. Syndicate men." Calder exhaled slowly. He'd heard the stories. Men deputized by mining interests or cattle barons claiming legal authority where there was none. Paid to clear land, silence resistance. Paid to erase. "They're hunting us, not because we ran, because one of us saw what they did, what one of them did to my sister." She looked toward the back corner, where a thin girl no older than 14 sat wrapped in a quilt, eyes downcast. Calder followed her gaze, something cold settling in his gut. "Her name is Ingyang," Wicháhpi said. She saw his face. "She remembers it, and if she lives, he burns." The fire popped sharply in the hearth. Calder didn't speak, but Wicháhpi didn't seem to need a response. "We know what this place is. We know who you were. People talk, even if you don't. We didn't come to hide, Mr. Boone." She stepped closer, not aggressive, just sure. "We came to end it." Calder stared at her for a long moment. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with decision, with a past he had buried deep and a future clawing at his door. In the distance, thunder rolled again. Not from the sky this time, from hooves. By midday, the wind had picked up again, stirring dry grass and loose dirt into uneasy swirls across the open pasture. Calder moved with purpose, inspecting the outbuildings, checking the fence lines, watching the northern ridge where a thread of dust now traced the horizon like a fuse inching toward fire. The girls remained inside, sharpening what few tools they had, repacking their belongings with a practiced efficiency that spoke of long travel and longer danger. One of them, a quiet girl named Taku, sat near the back door cleaning a knife with strips of cloth she tore from her own skirt. The baby slept on a bed of old feed sacks near the hearth, bundled so tightly it barely stirred except to sigh. Wicháhpi stepped out onto the porch without asking. Calder didn't turn to look at her, but heard the faint scuff of her moccasins on the warped wood. "There's 10, maybe 12 riders," she said plainly. "They travel light, but they won't wait. They're not the kind that make demands. Just finish what they start." Calder's eyes remained on the dust trail. "I know the kind," he finally said, and his voice came like gravel dragged through still water. Wicháhpi looked at him for a beat longer, as if measuring something unseen. Then she stepped off the porch and walked to the fence line, where she knelt and began dragging a crooked stick through the dirt, mapping something in the soil. The others followed, instinctively forming a semicircle around her, listening as she whispered. Calder approached slowly. He didn't interrupt. She had drawn the ranch from memory: main house, barn, root cellar, fences. Her plan was clear. They would not run. They would not beg. They would funnel the riders into blind corners, use the terrain, use the traps. Calder had long set for mountain lions and thieves. What was once meant to keep the world out would now be turned inward, like a snare snapping back on its maker. "You've been planning this," Calder said. It wasn't a question. Wicháhpi nodded. "We needed a place where they'd come without hesitation, where they'd think the fight was theirs to win." He looked at her then, really looked, not as a stranger, not as a trespasser, but as something closer to what he had once been, a person who had lost too much to ever fear losing again. "You think I'm part of your trap?" he asked quietly. She didn't smile, didn't flinch. "No, I think you're what makes it work." For a moment Calder said nothing. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn, his gait heavy but certain. He began dragging out rusted chains, spare timber, a coil of barbed wire thick with dust. Whatever part of him had died when May and the baby were buried was stirring again, not reborn, but restless. Behind him, the wind kicked higher, carrying with it the scent of ash and sweat and something else: blood. By sundown, the air had thickened with tension and dust, the kind that settles in the mouth and doesn't wash out easy. Calder worked with methodical urgency, his hands moving with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Every tool he touched, every nail driven, every coil of wire strung across the cattle gate came with a memory, some buried, some sharpened by grief. He hadn't prepared the land for battle, not exactly, but he'd fortified it against the unpredictable cruelty of men and animals alike. Shallow ditches meant for water runoff had become low channels to crawl through unseen. Gaps in the fence line, once patched hastily, now served as false exits. A pair of snares, long set for coyotes, had their triggers reset and bait changed. They were no longer hunting scavengers. The girls adapted quickly. They moved as a unit, quiet and precise, each knowing their place without orders. Calder watched as they reinforced the barn door, stacked stones beneath the porch steps, and soaked a bundle of rag-wrapped arrows in lamp oil. Not one of them hesitated. Whatever childhood had been theirs was gone, burned away in the same fire that had taken their brothers. Inside, Ingyang had not spoken once. She sat on the edge of Calder's bed, eyes fixed on a crack in the wall where wind slipped through like a whisper. Her hands clutched a strip of leather knotted 3 times, the way her mother had taught her to remember names when fear threatened to take them. Calder brought her a tin of warm broth. He didn't speak either, just set it beside her and left. She didn't move to drink it, but she didn't look away from the leather either. Outside, Wicháhpi knelt near the well, eyes closed, lips moving in prayer or preparation. Calder approached, not to interrupt, but to stand beside her. The wind shifted again, colder this time, cutting through layers of flannel and flesh like a blade. It carried with it the faintest sound, distant hooves against frozen earth, barely audible beneath the rustle of dry weeds. "They're closer now," Wicháhpi said without opening her eyes. Calder nodded, almost to himself. "I know." The wind didn't just bring noise. It brought smell, old leather, burnt tobacco, the greasy tang of horse sweat, and fear masked by whiskey. Calder had known that smell in the war, and again after. It never left a man once it sank in. For years he had drowned in silence, choosing it over the chaos of memory. But now the wind spoke again, and it did not lie. It remembered death, it remembered fire, and it was telling him what came next. He turned back toward the house and saw the girls in position, bows strung, blades sheathed, traps set. The ranch had become a crucible, and every scar it bore had meaning now. The wind carried one last thing as night fell. Not a cry, not a warning. A promise. The first rider appeared just before midnight. He came alone, likely a scout, easing down the ridge line with the careless confidence of someone expecting no resistance. Calder spotted him from the loft window, outlined against the stars, rifle slung low, posture easy. It wasn't the posture of a soldier. It was the swagger of a man paid to do violence without consequence. Calder waited until the rider crested the last bend in the trail, then gave a short, low whistle. Taku and another girl were already in place by the fence. They moved like breath, swift and quiet, crouching low as the rider passed beneath the cottonwood. The tripwire was strung knee-high, nearly invisible in the moonlight. When the rider's boot caught it, the branch above snapped downward, slamming into his chest and knocking him flat with a wet grunt. Before he could shout, Taku was on him, blade pressed hard to his throat. She didn't slit it. She looked to Calder first. He gave a small nod. She bound his wrists instead, dragging him behind the brush. Wicháhpi joined them moments later and whispered in Lakota. Taku frowned, but obeyed, tightening the gag. They weren't killing unless they had to. Inside the house, Ingyang hadn't moved. She sat exactly as she had been hours earlier, hands still gripping the knotted leather, eyes still fixed on that same narrow crack in the wall. Calder stepped inside and paused by the door, hesitant to disturb her silence. But then she spoke, so softly he almost missed it. "He's with them." Calder turned. "The one who hurt me. He rides with them. I heard him before. His laugh." Her voice trembled, but didn't break. "I know it." Calder's throat tightened. He didn't ask her to describe him. He didn't want the details. They were already there, in the way her shoulders curled inward, in how her fingers dug into the palm of her hand until they left crescents of pain. What mattered was that she remembered, and that she intended to survive. "They won't get inside," he said quietly. Ingyang looked up at him for the first time, Her eyes were rimmed with red but steady. "They always get inside, unless you stop them." She didn't say it like a plea. It was a statement of fact, cold and unflinching. Outside, another shot rang out. This one was distant, not part of their plan. The rest of the riders had arrived. Calder moved to the door. Wicháhpi met him halfway, face drawn tight. "They're testing the fences, looking for weaknesses." Calder nodded. "They'll find one." "That's the point." She studied him for a moment. "And what happens when they get through?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the barn, to the cellar, to the hills he once rode with his daughter in his arms. Then back to the girls, faces set with the kind of resolve that didn't come from training, but from loss. "When they get through," he said, voice low and final, "we show them what it cost us to survive this long." By the time the full group of riders had circled the property, the land had turned against them. They didn't know it yet, but every post they leaned on, every trail they crept down, every piece of terrain that looked worn or weathered had been chosen with intent. Calder had spent years wiring this land for solitude, but solitude shared was defense multiplied. Now his traps had new meaning. The first horse stumbled into a pit near the north fence, just a shallow collapse of dry earth masked with brush and loose rock, enough to snap a leg and send the rider tumbling. The scream was brief, not of pain, but surprise. Then the rider was silent, either unconscious or warned quiet by the others. A second man took an arrow to the thigh, trying to flank the barn. It came from the shadows near the chicken coop, loosed by a girl no older than 12. She didn't wait to see it land. She was already gone, moving low between barrels, setting the next snare. The attackers regrouped at the southern slope, where the old cattle trail wound toward the house. It was the most open route, the least threatening. It was also where Calder had planted the hunting spikes. He watched from the loft window, counting shapes in the dark, listening to the clink of bridles and low murmured orders. They hadn't called out for surrender. They hadn't demanded the girls. This wasn't negotiation. It was elimination. Wicháhpi crouched beside him, bow strung across her back, eyes focused. "They're spreading out, testing corners," she whispered. "They're waiting to see if we break pattern," Calder said. "They think we're scared." "Good. Let them keep thinking it." He glanced at her. "You ever killed a man before?" Her answer came steady. "I've watched it done. That's enough." He nodded. "Don't hesitate. Don't aim to wound." "I won't." They moved to separate vantage points, Wicháhpi slipping through the trap door to the root cellar, Calder heading for the porch. Every board creaked a memory under his boots. The porch had once held a cradle. Now it held a rusted shotgun and a bucket of oil-soaked rags. In the dark beyond the fence, Calder saw movement. A glint of metal. The faint outline of a man raising his hand to signal. This was it. Not the final assault, but the push before it. A hard knock against the outer shell, designed to test what held firm and what cracked. Calder took position behind the old stove they'd dragged out from storage, its iron belly filled with broken glass and pitch. He didn't like killing. He hadn't since the war. But this wasn't the war. This wasn't about politics or orders or survival for its own sake. This was about children who'd been hunted and hurt, who stood between the last of their innocence and the fire coming to claim them. Calder Boone wasn't defending a homestead anymore. He was guarding what was left of the world when justice failed. It started with a lantern. Thrown from the shadows, it shattered against the side of the barn and lit the dry, pitch-stained boards in a heartbeat. Flames curled upward, hungry and bright, casting wild shadows across the yard. The horses screamed inside, panicked by heat and smoke. Calder cursed under his breath and ran. Wicháhpi was already there, flinging open the stall doors while two of the girls worked the gate. The animals bolted into the open night, eyes rolling, hooves thundering against the earth. One rider, thinking he saw an opportunity, leaned from the saddle to shoot, but Taku was waiting. Her arrow caught him in the shoulder, spinning him back. He toppled hard, his horse stumbling without him. The fire leapt from wall to rafters. Sparks drifted upward into the night sky like dying stars. Calder grabbed the old pump and began dousing the side closest to the house. It was hopeless to save the barn, but the wind had shifted. If they didn't contain it, the house would follow. Another shot cracked through the dark, this one close, and Calder ducked behind the trough. Wicháhpi crouched beside him, breathing fast. "They're using the fire to draw us out," she said. He nodded grimly. "That means they're scared." Scared men were dangerous, more erratic, more likely to shoot wildly or torch everything in reach. The baby cried out from inside the house, and Ingyang's voice followed, low and desperate, trying to soothe. Calder looked back toward the front steps, the firelight flickering across the porch rails. He saw the shape then, one of the riders moving in from the side, crawling low, rifle slung and blade in hand. Wicháhpi saw him too. She moved before Calder could stop her. She ran straight at the rider, silent and fast, catching him off guard as he rose. Her foot caught his shin, and she slammed the handle of her blade into his face. He stumbled, swung wildly, and caught her along the ribs, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she twisted the knife into his gut and held it there until his legs gave out. When she stood, blood soaked the edge of her shirt, but her eyes burned clear. Calder reached her just as the flames caught the last of the hayloft. The barn groaned once, deeply, then collapsed inward with a roar. The wind gusted and the fire blew sideways, missing the house by inches. Embers scattered across the pasture like seeds. The riders paused again, retreating to the edges, unsure whether they had just gained ground or lit their own funeral pyre. Inside, the baby had gone quiet again. Not asleep, just still, as if even that tiny life understood that the silence meant something was about to change. Calder turned to Wicháhpi, who pressed one hand to her side and nodded once. They hadn't won anything yet, but the fire had drawn the line. Now the real siege would begin. The fences weren't built to hold men out. Not really. They were meant to keep cattle from wandering, to mark territory in a world that no longer believed in boundaries unless they came with deeds and bullets. But that night, as the wind picked up and the smell of scorched wood clung to the air, the fences served one last purpose. They told Calder where the enemy had gotten in. The eastern line had fallen, not cleanly, not with force. Someone had pried up the corner post, worked it loose without triggering the tripwire below. Smart. Quiet. A man who had done this before. Calder moved toward it under cover of darkness, hugging the edge of the well trench, shotgun slung low. Behind him the girls waited, each assigned to a quadrant. Wicháhpi had taken two of the younger ones to the south side. Taku and another girl held the west, where the land sloped and the shadows ran deep. He heard the footsteps before he saw the figure, slow, deliberate. No crunch of panic, no stutter of hesitation, just a steady creep through broken grass. Calder raised the shotgun, breath held. Then he saw the glint of metal, not a rifle, a belt buckle. The man was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a scar down one cheek that caught the moonlight. His hat was tilted low, but not enough to hide the sneer. Calder knew that face, maybe not the name, but the type. Hired violence wrapped in a badge and justification. Then another shadow emerged behind him, shorter, slighter, a rifle in hand, moving with more haste than care. They were coming in pairs now. Cover and strike. Calder waited until the first man stepped over the wire loop, the last remaining thread of the fence, then fired. The shot hit the dirt just beside the second man's boot, sending him stumbling. The first one spun, eyes wide, and Calder had him in his sights before he could speak. "Drop it," Calder said, voice low but firm. It cracked with disuse, but the words were clear. The man hesitated. Calder didn't. The second blast tore through the underbrush, scattering them both. One ran, the other fell, groaning and clutching his shoulder. Calder moved in, fast and without expression. He didn't kill him, not yet. But he took the man's weapon and kicked him hard enough to send a message. The warning shot had done its job. The others would be more cautious now, maybe even afraid. Back at the house, the fences were still holding in 3 directions, but it wouldn't last. The attackers had tested the perimeter. Now they'd changed tactics. Less noise, more knives. They'd come in close, cut the line from inside. Inside the cellar, Wicháhpi stitched her own side shut with a needle heated over a lantern flame. She didn't flinch. The girl beside her, no older than 15, held the thread taut and whispered a prayer under her breath. Outside, the wind shifted again. This time it wasn't carrying the smell of smoke or blood. It carried breath, close, watching. The riders were no longer just hunting. They were circling. Ingyang had not moved from the corner where Calder had first placed her. The baby slept beside her now, wrapped in a quilt too big for its tiny body. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows that painted the walls like ghosts, retelling an old, unfinished story. Calder entered quietly, shotgun resting against his leg, the scent of cordite still clinging to his coat. He paused by the door, eyes on her. She looked smaller than before, not in body, but in presence. Stillness clung to her like frost, but her eyes were open, and they were watching him. "I know who he is," she said softly. Her voice had no tremble this time. "He laughed when he held me down. He had a broken tooth on the right side, chewed tobacco, spit on the ground before he touched me." Calder felt his stomach twist, the old sickness rising. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt. She needed to say it. She had carried it too long. "He has a scar under his eye, left side. And he said his name, like he wanted me to remember it. Rigson. Billy Rigson." The name hit Calder like a match dropped in dry grass. Rigson had worked for the syndicate before. Calder had seen him in town once, drunk and loud, flashing his badge like it came with God's permission. Men like that didn't just enjoy cruelty. They depended on no one believing their victims would live long enough to speak. "He's the one leading them," Ingyang added, her voice firmer now. "He thinks I'm already dead." Calder nodded slowly. "He's wrong." From behind him, Wicháhpi's voice came low. "We've set the charges on the west fence. They'll push that side at dawn." Calder turned, his eyes narrowing. "We hold until then. After that, we let them come. And we make sure one of them leaves alive enough to carry your sister's words to the marshals." Ingyang looked at them both, something changing in her expression. It wasn't relief. It wasn't even hope. It was resolve, taking shape like iron, cooled and ready to strike. She stood. Her legs wobbled slightly, but she didn't fall. She picked up the baby and cradled it close. Wicháhpi stepped forward, eyes softening for a moment, brushing the girl's hair back gently. "You don't have to do more," she said. "You've already survived what most couldn't." Ingyang shook her head. "I'm not just surviving. I'm the reason they came here. I'm the reason they're going to die." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. Even the fire seemed to pause. Outside, the wind settled. Not quiet, not gone. Just waiting. Dawn rose blood orange over the canyon, staining the hills in a glow that felt more like warning than light. The wind had calmed, but tension gripped the land as tightly as frost held the last of the dry grass. Every shadow had weight now. Every sound held meaning. Calder crouched behind the water trough, rifle across his knees, his breath slow and even. His coat was damp with sweat, despite the cold. Wicháhpi was to his right, hidden beneath the porch rail. Her knife rested flat against the wood, fingers loose but ready. Across the yard, the others held position, some crouched behind barrels, others tucked into brush hollows or behind firewood stacks. The west fence gave first, just as they had expected. The charges Calder had buried in the posts, old mining caps packed with nails and grit, flashed loud but not wide. Enough to blind and disorient, not kill. That was the point. They wanted them close. They wanted Rigson to see where his confidence ended. The riders charged in behind the smoke, guns drawn, yelling threats they had shouted 100 times before, in other towns, at other camps, with no one left alive to remember. But this time the ground did not give. This time the earth pushed back. 2 fell immediately. 1 caught in the leg trap Calder had reset with iron teeth scavenged from an old wagon. The other dropped by a silent shot from Wicháhpi. Her aim was precise, and she didn't pause to watch him fall. Another made it to the porch. Calder let him come close before stepping out and swinging the butt of his rifle hard into the man's jaw. He crumpled without a sound. Calder turned and saw Rigson. He was on horseback still, circling the edge of the yard, looking for the source of the resistance. His hat was gone, and even from across the clearing, Calder saw the scar. He remembered that face now, not just from stories, from his own past. Rigson had been there years ago, when syndicate men cleared a valley 2 counties south, torching cabins, shooting livestock, taking what wasn't theirs. Calder had done nothing then. He had watched from the ridge and turned away. Not today. He raised the rifle, bracing it against the edge of the porch, lining the sight with the center of Rigson's chest. But before he could fire, Ingang stepped out from the doorway, baby in her arms, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. Rigson saw her. He reined in hard, his expression twisting into disbelief, then rage. He raised his pistol. Calder fired. The shot cracked like judgment. Rigson's shoulder snapped back, and he fell from the saddle, landing hard. The horse bolted. He tried to crawl, one hand reaching for his gun, but Wicháhpi was already moving. She crossed the yard in 3 strides and pinned him with her boot, knife drawn. Calder followed, breath tight, watching the girl who had led them all to this moment. Rigson looked up, teeth bloody, eyes wild. "You don't get to—" "You already did," Wicháhpi said quietly. Then she turned her blade sideways and pressed it against his throat, just hard enough to silence, but not to kill. 1 lives, she reminded Calder, to carry what she remembers. Calder nodded. Then he'll live, but he won't run. They bound him, tight and rough, dragged him to the fence, and pinned him there, wounded and shaking. Then they stood over him while the sun climbed higher, warming the blood-soaked dirt. The last rifle shot had been fired. The reckoning had come. Now came the weight of what followed. When the dust settled and the morning came full, the ranch stood quiet again. Not untouched, but upright. Smoke curled from the collapsed barn, ash drifting slowly toward the creek, like memories too heavy to rise. The bodies had been moved, not buried yet, but gathered with care behind the far pasture gate. They would not be left to rot in open air. Even enemies deserved that much dignity. Or perhaps it wasn't for them. Perhaps it was for the girls, for Calder, for the land itself. The one who survived, Rigson, lay bound beneath the stripped frame of the wagon, one arm broken, his lips cracked with pain and disbelief. He had stopped shouting hours ago. Now he just watched, eyes narrowed, face sunburnt and slack. Calder had taken his boots and tossed them in the creek. Ingang sat near the porch steps, the baby sleeping again on her lap. Her eyes tracked the wind, watching it ripple across the grass, like something she could read if she only looked hard enough. Wicháhpi sat beside her, silent. They had not spoken much since the final shot. Words would come later, for now there was only breath and earth. Calder poured a bucket of water over the porch rail, scrubbing away the bloodstains left by the last charge. His hands worked slow, not from pain, but from reverence. He had not known peace in years, but in that moment he found something adjacent. Not joy, not safety, but truth, and it was enough. By noon they were ready to ride. Wicháhpi packed what little they had salvaged, dried meat, salt, the water skin, the last of the clean cloth. The baby would travel strapped to Ingyang's back, swaddled tight. The others mounted up one by one, every movement deliberate, no wasted motion. Rigson watched them with a kind of horror Calder had seen before in war. Not fear of death, but of accountability. The man had lived his life under the protection of silence. Now silence had turned against him. He would speak, whether he wanted to or not. Calder stepped close, crouching down beside him. He didn't speak right away, just met his eyes. "She remembers everything. You will tell the marshals what you did, what you saw, and if you lie, if you try to run, I will find you again. That's not a threat. It's just what's true." Rigson said nothing, but he knew. The girls mounted up. Wicháhpi gave Calder a final nod. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet moment of understanding passed between two people who had stood in the same fire and come through it, changed. Ingyang turned once in the saddle, just enough to look back at the porch, at the place where silence had first broken. "You coming with us?" she asked. Calder shook his head gently. "Not this time." She didn't press. She turned forward again, reins taut, baby nestled close. They rode out slow, not hiding, not fleeing, but bearing witness to the land, to what had happened, to what it meant. The wind followed them for a time, trailing behind like smoke. Then it turned back. After they were gone, Calder remained on the porch, long into the afternoon. The sun moved slowly across the sky, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted over the scorched dirt. The land, bruised but breathing, settled into stillness. Not peace exactly, but the kind of quiet that comes after something terrible has passed through and left only what could endure. He walked the perimeter again, not out of habit, but necessity. He reset the fences, patched a gate, pulled the bent spike from where it had caught one of the last intruders. He buried 2 of the bodies under the northern rise, where the earth was softest. For the rest, he left markers made from old fence boards, nailed upright into the ground. No names, just witness. By dusk, he stood at the creek behind the house, staring at the stones where May and the baby had been laid years before. The marker was weathered now, almost unreadable, but his hands knew the shape of it. He touched the top edge, fingers tracing the grooves he'd carved in silence and grief. He didn't speak aloud. He never had. But this time his breath caught in his throat, and something close to words rose. "They're gone," he murmured, "but not the way others went, not lost, not erased." The wind rustled low in the grass behind him, soft and steady. He closed his eyes and listened. That night he didn't lock the door. He left it cracked, as if expecting someone to return, or as if some part of him still needed to believe the world might come knocking again and ask something worth answering. The ranch was no longer fortified in the same way. The traps were dismantled, the barbed wire coiled and set aside. The place had done its work, not just for the girls, but for him. It had been a prison once, built out of shame and memory. Now, it was something else. He didn't light the fire. Instead, he sat in the dark with the dog curled beside him, the house quiet, the smell of smoke and blood slowly fading into the floorboards. He could still hear the baby's cry, not in pain, but in life. That sound had stayed with him longer than any scream. In the distance, a lone coyote called, sharp and mournful. Another answered. The wind passed through the canyon again, carrying dust and the faintest echo of hooves long gone. Calder Boone, once buried by silence, now sat inside it with purpose. He hadn't survived because he was brave. He had survived because he was stubborn, because he had nowhere left to go. But now, that survival had meaning again, not for what he did, for what he protected. And in the end, that was what endured. The road north was long, and in some places barely a road at all, just a line through the hills, marked by broken grass and the faded memories of old wagon ruts. The girls rode without haste, not because they were tired, though they were, but because speed no longer dictated their survival. What mattered now was arrival and what they carried with them. Ing-yang rode at the center, the baby strapped tight against her back, her hands steady on the reins. Wicháhpi rode just ahead, scanning the horizon with the calm precision of someone who had lived too long without certainty. Behind them, the younger girls kept close, moving as a single body, quiet but alert. They did not speak much. The silence between them was not from fear, but from understanding. Every one of them had seen the fire and walked away. Every one of them had chosen not to hide. They passed through the edge of a trading post by midday, a small cluster of cabins and a general store, the kind of place that watched strangers but asked no questions. A woman stepped out from behind the counter as they approached, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she said nothing when Wicháhpi dismounted and handed her a list. Flour, bandages, powder. Nothing that raised alarms, just survival items. The woman rang the bell inside and returned a short time later with a burlap sack, handing it over without a word. Something in Wicháhpi's gaze had told her this was not a group to interfere with. They rode again before the sun fell, moving through low pine where the shadows deepened early. They made camp near a bend in the river, not far from where a burned-out grove of trees stood black against the sky. The fire had been here too once, the kind that eats everything. But green had begun to return along the edges, and the girls took comfort in that. That night, Wicháhpi sat by the river with Ing-yang beside her, both watching the water shift and murmur over stone. The baby slept near the fire, wrapped in both warmth and silence. "We'll make it to the agency by end of week," Wicháhpi said, her voice low and certain. "And they'll listen?" Ing-yang asked, not out of doubt, but weariness. "They will," Wicháhpi replied. "If not to us, then to the man still bleeding back at that ranch. They'll want his story, and when he tells it, it'll match yours." Ing-yang nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of her coat. "What happens after?" Wicháhpi looked out across the water. "After, we keep going. Not because we're running, but because we still have things to build. And the baby, he'll need more than memory." They didn't say anything else. The fire crackled softly behind them, and the sky turned deep indigo, stars pushing through. North was still a long way off, but the worst of the journey had passed. What lay ahead wasn't safety. It was choice. And for the first time in their lives, it belonged to them. The ranch was quiet again, but it was not the same silence Calder Boone had once known. It no longer felt like a wall he had built brick by brick to keep the world at bay. It was different now, thinner somehow, permeable, as if something had been cracked open and now let in more than just wind. He moved slowly through the house that morning, cleaning without urgency, patching the bullet holes in the siding with scraps of pine. He set the porch steps back in place, then rehung the lantern that had fallen during the firefight. It still worked, barely. He cleaned the soot from the glass, polished the metal, and hung it higher. Inside, the dog slept near the hearth, twitching occasionally in its dreams. Calder poured himself a cup of cold coffee, not because he needed it, but because the routine helped. Some part of him still craved rhythm, even after everything had changed. On the table sat a folded piece of cloth left behind by Wicháhpi. It was the baby's first swaddle, worn thin at the edges, patched with thread. Calder hadn't noticed it when they rode out, but he found it the next morning, neatly placed where he used to sit. Not forgotten. Deliberate. He didn't know if it was a token of thanks or simply something too heavy to carry farther. Either way, he didn't touch it. Just left it there, a reminder that silence could hold meaning, that absence wasn't always emptiness. Later that day, he walked up to the hill behind the house. The grass had grown higher since the last time he'd been there. He knelt before the stones marking May and the baby, brushing away leaves and setting 2 fresh rocks beside them. "I kept the promise this time," he said. The words didn't come easy, but they came. The breeze stirred the cottonwoods overhead, rustling leaves that whispered without judgment. He sat there for a long time, watching the sky change. When he returned to the house, the sun was low and golden, stretching shadows across the fields like reaching hands. He closed the door behind him, but left the shutters open. The fire wasn't lit. The room didn't need it. He stood in the center of the room, looking around at the walls he had once built to hold back the world. And he realized they no longer held him. He didn't speak aloud again that night. Not to the dog, not to the wind, but he didn't fear the silence anymore. Because now it carried something with it. Not ghosts, not regret. Purpose. And that was enough.